welcome back to the channel. My name is Professor G, and for those of you who are new or don't know me, I'm a law professor and a historian, and my area of scholarly research is in the slave laws and slave codes that sustained and maintained the antebellum slaveocracy that eventually became the Confederate States of America. And today I wanted to delve into the world of Graham Hancock, mostly because I've been following a lot of archaeologists here on YouTube, a lot of science communicators, who have done plenty of episodes on Graham Hancock and his Netflix documentary and all of this. And one of the themes that continues to come up in all of these reviews is that a lot of what he uses, or sites that he sources or refers to, is based in racist ideology. And today I wanted to discuss that because it really is dangerous for Graham Hancock to do what he does. And what he does, and again, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm not a science communicator, I'm a law professor. Again, I've said my credentials multiple times. I study slave laws and slave codes and the antebellum slaveocracy, the antebellum South. But what he does is exactly what the enslavers of the antebellum South did to justify slavery. And by throwing out this idea that there is some advanced civilization that existed, and it is the group that disseminated the information and technology that other civilizations used in order to advance, that has racial undertones to it, because what it is in effect saying is that indigenous peoples around the world could not have created such magnificent things or had societies. They needed this advanced civilization to get them started. So it takes away the benefit and the credit that these indigenous people should have for the wonderful things that they have constructed. And that is exactly what happened in the antebellum South when it came to slavery. Now, I'm not saying that Graham Hancock is racist or anything like that, but I want to point out how his idea is what was used by enslavers in the antebellum South to justify the institution of African slavery. And again, I'm going to do a little bit of a recap here for anyone who's new if you search Graham Hancock and you came to the channel for the first time. So I'm going to use a few primary sources here. The first is an inquiry into the laws of Negro slavery by Thomas R.R. Cobb. Now, Thomas R.R. Cobb was a very famous antebellum jurist from Georgia. He was affectionately known by the Confederates and the Confederacy as the James Madison of the Confederacy, because he was so instrumental in the framing and the writing of the Confederate Constitution, which enshrined for all time the institution of African slavery. And this book, as I've said before, was meant to be a treatise for any practicing attorney who might have to argue a case in court dealing with an enslaved individual. So it covers hundreds of court cases in the antebellum South. It breaks down, who is a slave, how slavery is justified. It's the natural order of the African race, all of this into emancipation, manumission laws, fugitive slaves, punishment for slaves. All of this is contained in this book, and it is such a resource, or it was such a resource when it came to enslaved court cases, that many antebellum courts in the South, especially state Supreme Court, cited from it multiple times. So you can actually find this. You can find state Supreme Court justices citing to an inquiry of the law of Negro slavery in some of their opinions. So let's start off with the foundation of why what Graham Hancock is doing is what the antebellum enslavers did. And again, sort of a recap. So there was a case in the mid-1700s in Great Britain called the Somerset Case, or the Somerset Decision. And a long story short, go back and watch my previous videos on this. An enslaved man was brought to London. He escaped. He was captured, went to court in order to decide his freedom. And Lord Mansfield, who was presiding on the King's Bench at that time, made the decision that slavery is so odious, it goes so against human nature, that it cannot exist with positive law. Meaning, it is so horrible, it is so inhumane, that it could only exist if a law is on the books that says slavery can exist. And to that end, since there was no law in England that said slavery can exist, then this enslaved person became free as soon as he set foot on British soil. So this presented a problem for many jurists in the colonies that would eventually become the United States, and especially in the slaveholding states in the South. What do? Did you need a positive law to have slavery? I believe only one state did. Georgia was the only state, I believe, that had on its books a positive law to allow for slavery. So was this necessary? Did you need to have it? And the short answer that they came up with was no. It was not necessary because, against what Lord Mansfield said, it was not odious to the laws of nature. Slavery was, in fact, the African's natural condition. And if they could prove that slavery fell within the law of nature, or within, what nature considered acceptable, if it really was the natural place for people of African descent, then there doesn't need to be any law to sustain slavery because it is the natural order of things. And Thomas Cobb spends a great deal of time trying to explain this in an inquiry into the laws of Negro slavery. So let's look at it. He starts by saying, we adopt as the law of nature. So he's going to define what the law of nature is. We adopt as the law of nature, when applied to man in his intercourse with his fellow man, that obligation which reason and conscience impose, so as to shape his course as to attain the greatest happiness, and arrive at the greatest perfection of which his nature is susceptible. Consequently, whatever interferes with the attainment of this happiness and perfection does violence to the law of his nature, and whatever promotes or is consistent therewith is sanctioned by the law of his nature. In this view, natural rights depend entirely upon the nature of the possessor, not of the right, for it is the former and not the latter that determines the question of right. Hence, to speak of the natural right of personal liberty is unphilosophical until the previous question is settled that such liberty will conduce to the happiness and perfection of the possessor. So what he's saying is that we can't just look at a right and say it's a natural right, such as liberty. We have to look and see if that natural right of liberty benefits the person who is having it, or if it hurts his condition. If it's good for him, then it is a natural right. It is the law of nature. If it hurts him, then it is not part of the law of nature. So, as you see, what is going to happen here is that they're going to make the argument that liberty is bad for people of African descent, and slavery is good, therefore it is the natural law to enslave people of African descent, because of white superiority, right? He goes on to quote Puffandorf, who was a German jurist and philosopher, and he says, "It is most evident that some men are imbued with such a happiness of wit and parts as enables them not only to provide for themselves and their own affairs, but to direct and govern others, and that some again are so extremely stupid and heavy as to be unfit to govern themselves, so that they either do mischief or do nothing, unless others guide and compel them. And farther, that these last, being commonly furnished by nature with strong and hardy bodies, are capable of bringing many notable advantages to others by their labor and service. Now, when these have the fortune to live in subjection to a wise director, they are without doubt fixed in such a state of life as is most agreeable to their genius and capacity." So he's quoting a German jurist and philosopher saying, look, in nature, there are superior races. And one race could be so benevolent and so intelligent that being in service to them by a lower race is actually beneficial to that lower race. So here, and he's saying, look, clearly some races are just physically built to do things like labor. And oh, how they benefit when they are under the intelligence of that wiser race, right? So you see the groundwork he's laying. What he's going to say is that because people of African descent are mentally inferior and physically built for labor, it is only natural that they work as slaves under white people. That's the foundation he's building. He goes on to say, continuing in his definition of what is slavery and how slavery is natural, if the physical, intellectual, and moral development of the African race are promoted by a state of slavery, and their happiness secured to a greater extent than if left at liberty, then their enslavement is consistent with the law of nature and does not violate any of its provisions. If the Negro's own happiness thereby best promoted? And he goes on to then show us how it is. And first he says that the inquiry into the physical adaptation of the Negro to a state of servitude is clear. His black color fits him for the endurance of the heat of long continued summers. So he says, is slavery beneficial for people of African descent? Let's look. Well, one, they're built for slavery. They're built to be outdoors. It's better for them. They can labor out in the sun. They can do, hard labor. And he clearly says that people of African descent are mentally inferior to anyone of the Caucasian race. He says, our conclusion from this investigation must be that the Negro race is inferior physically and mentally to the Caucasian. Certain it is that the Negro as we now find him, whether in a state of bondage or in his native wilds, exhibits such a weakness of intellect that in the words of Puffandorf, quoting Puffandorf again, when he has the fortune to live in subjection to a wise director, he is, without doubt, fixed in such a state of life as is most agreeable to his genius and capacity. So what he's doing is he's saying that people of African descent are natural, their natural condition is to be in a state of slavery. And to go even further, let's look at how religious organizations looked at this. So in 1861, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church said that the slave system has proven kindly and benevolent and has provided real effective discipline to a people who could not be elevated in any other way. Slavery, the Presbyterian Church declared, was the black man's normal condition. And this actually created some serious problems for these jurists and these enslavers towards the end of the Civil War. See, as the Civil War progressed, and it really changed from being about just preserving the Union to, after the Emancipation Proclamation, preserving the Union and to ending the institution of slavery, many enslaved who heard of the Emancipation Proclamation realized that freedom was either coming or they could escape to freedom. So the South, the Confederacy, realizing it was losing the war, a lot of them argued over whether or not it was time to enlist and arm their slaves to fight for the Confederacy. Well, knowing that the enslaved had already heard that their freedom was almost guaranteed, it was coming. The Union was going to win. It was just a matter of time when Union lines got to your plantation and you were then either freed or if you ran off. They knew that the only way to encourage slaves to fight would be to guarantee them their freedom. But now we have a problem. If the natural condition for someone from Africa or of African descent is slavery, then how could a reward for doing good be to remove them from that system that was best conducive to their happiness? You see the problem here? And a lot of them understood this. So Hal Cobb, who is the brother of Thomas R.R. Cobb, and again, people might say, well, Professor G, who cares about these people? Where are you getting this from? He was the governor of Georgia at one time, the Speaker of the House at one time. He was the Secretary of the Treasury until secession of Georgia, and then he left and joined the Confederacy. So this isn't just some peon. This is an actual respected politician and jurist, again, in the antebellum South in the state of Georgia. He clearly said, the day that you make soldiers of them, meaning the slaves, is the beginning of the end of the revolution. If slaves make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong, right? He's saying you can't reward, if the best condition for someone of African descent is in slavery, you can't reward them by taking them out of the best position and putting them to some kind of inferior position. In fact, the Richmond Examiner, the newspaper in Richmond, Virginia, said, according to this message, right, the message being that slaves could fight for the Confederacy if this was something the Confederate government was willing to do, according to this message, it is a rich reward for faithful service to turn a Negro wild. Slavery, then, in the eyes of Mr. Davis, Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, keeps the Negro out of something which he has the capacity to enjoy. If the case be so, then slavery is originally, radically, incurably wrong and sinful, and the sum of barbarism. So they understood that slavery was barbaric unless people of African descent belonged enslaved because it would better their condition. And when this idea came out of giving them freedom to fight for the Confederacy, they said, well, you can't do that. Why would a reward be to take them out of something that benefits them and put them into something that would be more dangerous to them or not conducive to their happiness? And going back to Thomas R.R. Cobb, when he talks about the Caucasian, he does quote some other philosophers here, but he says, the Caucasian differs from all other races. He is humane, he is civilized, he progresses. He conquers with his head as well as with his hands. It is intellect, after all, that conquers, not the strength of a man's arm. The Caucasian has often been the master of other races, though never their slave. Republics are Caucasian. All the great sciences are of Caucasian origin. All inventions are Caucasian. Now, this is where we start to get into the realm of Graham Hancock. Because did you see what they just said there? What they said was that any good invention, all civilization, all civilized governments, like republics, come from Caucasians. So I just showed you, and I gave you multiple sources, that the system of African slavery in the antebellum South and the Confederacy was 100% based on white supremacy and race. And that the Southern jurists believe if they could prove that Africans, their natural condition was to be enslaved, then slavery didn't require any positive law because it was the natural order of things. I then showed you that they had issues with this from like, well, we can't free slaves as a reward if the best place for them to be is enslaved. And you actually see this. I just had a paper published about emancipation in the antebellum South, in the slaveholding states. And right towards the beginning of the Civil War, many states outlawed emancipation by enslavers altogether because they realized it couldn't be a reward, right? You could do what you want with your property to certain extents within certain states, and since slaves were considered property, manumission and emancipation was possible, but they slowly stopped it as we got closer to the Civil War, to the point where many states ended it altogether, and you could never have a justification for good behavior being freedom if the best place for someone of African descent was to be enslaved. And then I just showed you how Thomas Cobb quotes that all great things came from Caucasians. Well, let's look at what he says about people of African descent in Africa. He says, mentally inferior, now certain he is, talking about people of African descent, talking about Africans, black people. The typical, and by the way, I know a lot of this is very difficult to read. It's difficult for me to read, it's difficult for you to hear. But this is exactly as it's written, and I'm trying to stay true to the historical facts here. So let's just, just read it for what it is. And if it troubles you, turn the video off, of course. But this is what they believed. And we're going to connect to what Graham Hancock does and why it's dangerous, even though this is not his beliefs, clearly, but this was his idea of this advanced civilization seeding everything else and being the reason for technology is the exact thing that these Southern jurists were doing when it came to slavery, right? The typical woolly-haired races have never invented a reasoned theological system, discovered an alphabet, framed a grammatical language, nor made the least step in science or art. They have never comprehended what they have learned or retained a civilization taught them by contact with more refined nations as soon as that contact has ceased. They have at no time formed great political states, nor commenced a self-evolving civilization. Conquest with them has been confined to kindred tribes and produced only slaughter. Even Christianity of more than 3 centuries durations in the Congo has scarcely excited a progressive civilization. So what he's saying is any sub-Saharan civilization. And by the way, when they did talk, and you can find in Thomas R. Cobb, he does a history of slavery before, then he gets into the laws of Negro slavery in the second half of the book. And there was supposed to be a second volume, but unfortunately for us, Thomas Cobb was killed, I believe, at the Battle of Fredericksburg. He was a Confederate brigadier general. But to get to the point, when they talk about Egypt and they see advanced civilizations, they clearly make the distinction, oh, those aren't the Africans we're talking about. And they do try and give credit to Caucasians and white people, or at least a derivative of Caucasians, when it came to any sort of civilization in North Africa. But any sub-Saharan civilization never made a political organization, never had a theological invention, never had a theology or religion, never had an alphabet, never had any of this stuff. They've never produced anything. Then remember what I told you when he quoted about Caucasians, all great republics, all art, all science, all of that comes from Caucasians. If you discount what indigenous people are able to do, the societies they're able to build, the things they're able to do with their own intellect, their own mind, if you discount how intelligent these people were, thousands of years ago to be able to do some of the things they did, and you attribute anything that is found within the area that they lived to some advanced civilization, clearly you're doing the same thing that these enslavers were doing by saying, oh, these people were so dumb they couldn't have possibly come up with it. right? It's not in their nature to do. They're not able to do such a thing. And that's what Graham Hancock's theories do. It'd be different if there was evidence to support some advanced civilization, but he claims there is no evidence. Well, if there is no evidence, then what you're pushing out there is the same exact thing that these enslavers were pushing out there, because there was no evidence for anything they claimed either. White supremacy is white supremacy. It is based on racism. It is based on the idea that white people are superior in all ways to every other race, and if any other race or indigenous people created something, in some way the white man did it, or the white man gave them the technology to do it, or a white race existed before the indigenous people did and created it, and the indigenous people just lived there after and took it over, or things like that. So again, pseudo-history, revisionist history, is dangerous. Pseudo-history is what allowed for the institution of African slavery to exist in the United States. And as I've shown you, clearly they used this justification all the way through the antebellum period to the end of the Civil War and the 13th Amendment. And as I've said in previous videos, you can clearly see that the racism, because the system was based on white supremacy, that white supremacy didn't end with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. And that's why the system of African slavery was so devastating long past the end of slavery in the United States. And the systemic racism that continued through the legal system, through Reconstruction, failed Reconstruction, the Jim Crow era, the Civil Rights era, and still plagues us today, is because of this pseudo-history. So, as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you for the next video.